purpose app.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Good evening. Nice to see you all today for coming and seeing what amazing work the interns have done this summer. And the topic is obviously very important, why the people with disabilities are not enough in the workforce. So we'll learn more about that. Before that, maybe a little bit about Voice of SAP. Uh, Voice of specially able people, as the name says, specially able people. The entire advocacy voice is based on ability centric perspective. So once society, people at by large start understanding ability, the empowerment is possible, education, employment, etc. So that is our overall vision of being a transformation catalyst to create a society where people with disability have a life with dignity and independence by creating accessible and inclusive society. Certainly, we are very active on the ground with 10,000 plus volunteers. We have enabled 2,000 plus persons with disabilities by giving assistive devices or surgical interventions. We also have ensured that more than 18,000, we have developed our digital tools for which, the digital tools are promoting accessibility and inclusion for, and we'll talk about it in the next two slides. But overall, as of now, as a prototype, 18,000 places are rated for accessibility in VO SAP mobile app. During the COVID, we also helped 6,500 people with grocery and PPE, personal protection kits, etc. And we have funds to go up to 11,000 people. So work is going on right now because of the pandemic. Two distinctions I would like to make sure that we have it for all of you. That the first distinction is that we are special consultative, having special consultative status with United Nations. Just to give a perspective, only 6 disability-centric organizations from US has this status, and worldwide 62 organizations. So we take pride in having access to United Nations system to bring our perspective to the larger global community. The second distinction is that we are recently given status of certifying organization to give President's Volunteer Service Award, which is very valuable to many volunteers. So all in all, we are doing something that has been recognized and that has inspired many, many youth and people to join the mass movement. Next slide. So as I was talking about WhatsApp mobile app, that is a very multi-purpose mobile app, but the key things it does is obviously the community of more than 10,000 people you can see in your city who is the person who has taken the place to volunteer, but also together you all become change maker in the community. So you go around, let's say USC, we have 30% places are not accessible that the students from USC have found. Every college we can find out and do the rating that how many places are yet to be made accessible. So that is the first data. But and it's a public utility app for, let's say, a country like India where places of accessible places are not enough. That's where you will see the benefit of value for somebody in wheelchair to find accessible ATM, accessible restaurant, accessible post office, things like that. So it's very useful tool. The second part of that is for the non-accessible part places, we are promoting crowdsourced activism. What does it mean? That if the place, let's say USC building is not accessible, 50 students of USC can simply enter the email address of the authority. He or she will get 50 different emails with the data. So that's what we are like data-driven advocacy, which is this research program is an extension of how we can bring data-driven advocacy so that it appeals to the decision makers. Next slide. And this app is available on Android, iOS. You can download and experience and join the community. I would encourage the new guests today who have joined us. The second digital tool that we developed is virtual 3D art gallery, promoting inclusion. This art gallery, we had a very, very good successful program last year, wherein from 52 countries, 4,200 artists participated, out of which only 500 plus were person with disability, others were not disabled. So the idea is to inspire people who are not disabled, the way you see today, and we have all these students nobody has disability, but they are all inspired to change the reality for people with disability. So the art is a very powerful tool to touch the heart. So it was art from heart. So you all can check out this virtual 3D gallery on the subject of disability. All the entries came and we selected 250 to be put on this art gallery. It's a free access, everybody can see. So we are taking it to LA USD or San Jose USD or many other communities, to promote the inclusion right at the early stage with the children. Next slide. Here is a short video around 2 minutes that will give you a good idea about Voice of SAP as an organization. So let's start that. Thank you once again. I welcome as a founder of Voice of SAP to all the guests today. And without any further delay, Manushree, over to you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sai. As you heard from what he had to say, we're very grateful and blessed to have his mentorship both this year and last year as well. To introduce myself, my name is Manushree Desai. I'm currently a rising senior at the University of Southern California. And I, along with Anusha, had the privilege of starting VOSAP Collegiate, which is the collegiate division of our organization. As college-going students, we were very encouraged to engage the collegiate voice in the disability rights conversation. And when we started this program, it was kind of at the precipice of COVID. And so sent back home, we were still trying to foster this incredible momentum in the disability sector. And we found that through doing data-driven research with undergraduate and graduate students. So we had the privilege of having over 25 interns last year who conducted over 14 different research projects in the disability sector. And this year, we're even more excited to bring a bit more refinement and focus to that research work as we pursue 5 different research projects. So with that, I'll let Anusha introduce herself and tell you a bit about what we're working on this year.
Definitely. I too just want to thank everyone for coming out here on a Thursday afternoon or evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Like Manashri said, my name is Anusha, and I am also a rising senior at the University of Southern California. Just to talk a little bit more about the program that we're running this summer, similar to last summer, we have around 24 interns conducting research in 5 distinct topic areas. Our teams are supported by 2 incredible editorial interns, a communications intern, as well as a graphics design intern for social media outreach. So you must be wondering, what are these projects that we're researching? Well, they range from everything from looking at what the advertising and CSR landscape looks like for persons with disabilities to sort of analyzing what federal and state programs and policies are offered for persons with disabilities. We also have a team researching what assistive technology looks like in the current market. And finally, we have our team presenting today, looking closely into why employment discrimination exists among persons with disabilities, but more from that from Rachel.
Yes, thank you all for those introductions. And I would now like to introduce you to the team researching employment-related ADA noncompliance. They're led by their project manager, Sophie, and made up of research interns, Madeline, Laura, Sabrina, and Vanessa. And now I'll hand it over to Sophie so you can hear more about their research. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. We are the team doing employment-related ADA non-compliance. Basically, we studied a lot of trends in ADA lawsuits and accommodations, and we also did a lot of research into the value of having persons with disabilities on the workforce and why there's such a huge gap between them and their other counterparts. So, to introduce myself, I'm Sophie Minukian. I'm the project manager. I'm a senior at UC Berkeley. Very surprising, I'm a senior. And yes, I am very passionate about disability advocacy. I have been for the last, I think, 4 or 5 years, more so in the autism and neurodiversity categories to do with employment inclusion. But that's why I joined VOSAP. Last spring, I joined VOSAP because I wanted to expand my reach and I love helping people. And I think VOSAP does a great job at doing that. So without further ado, the other team members are going to introduce themselves.
Hello, everyone. We're so happy that you're here today. My name is Maddie Fulchero, and I'm a rising junior at Cornell. I chose to join VOSAP because I'm so passionate about creating a more equitable future for my friends and family members with disabilities. And also, I do want to go into disability law in the future, so this was a perfect precursor to that.
Hey everyone, thanks for making it to our presentation. My name is Sabrina. I'm one of the research interns for this team. And I joined this team specifically as well as VOSAP because I'm interested in disability justice in the employment sector. I think equal access to career success is the foundation of any society, as we all know, but unfortunately in the United States and also around the world, not everyone has equal access to a workplace. And when they do, accommodations sometimes aren't made equitable. And so it's clear we need to do more. And so knowledge is sort of that first step to bridging that gap. And so that's why I'm here. And now I will pass it off to Laura.
Hello, I'm Laura McGrath. I recently graduated from Cornell University, where I studied labor and inequality studies. And that's how I came to join VOSAP and this team for this summer to further disability inclusion within the workforce.
My name is Vanessa Nguyen. I'm a rising junior at the University of Southern California, and I am involved in VOSAP because as someone with personal experience in the disability sector, I know how daunting navigating employment and professional industry can be and want to do further research and exploration into a topic that impacts millions of lives.
Amazing. So now we're going to be going into
So the current situation in employment-related ADA noncompliance is very troubling and demands further investigation. In 2020, 61.8% of people without disabilities were employed, but only 17.9% of persons with disabilities were employed. And despite ratification of the American with Disabilities Act and its amending statutes in 1990, many of which aim to level vocational opportunities for people with and without disabilities, the percentage of individuals with disabilities to participate in the US workforce today is still extremely low. In a survey, more than half of employers said that they spent close to no money on accommodations, and the concerns over potential accommodation costs present a major issue for employers. And even though many findings indicate that the majority of these accommodations are inexpensive and eventually balance out with increased productivity and revenue that these workers bring, the low accommodation costs contrast with high settlement monetary benefits employers are burdened with when the ADA statutes are not complied with, such as a $1.2 million settlement from Walmart in 2021 for ADA noncompliance and discrimination. Clearly, the fight in ending negative stigmas surrounding the hiring of persons with disabilities and employment discrimination is still ongoing to this day.
So to continue off of what Vanessa said, our project looked at the employment situation of persons with disabilities since the enactment of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. The ADA prohibited discrimination against individuals with disability and focused specifically on employment protections within Section 1. A portion of our project also focused on California, which additionally has the UNRRA Act to provide protections to persons with disabilities in regards to business and public accommodations. As Vanessa noted, the fight to include people with disabilities within the workforce continues, and despite the accommodation cost being low, the ADA settlement costs continue to grow. And so with that information, we decided to proceed with this project, and Sabrina will introduce our project question.
Thanks, Laura. So as Laura and Vanessa said, there is still a stark gap between the number of disabled and non-disabled employees in the workplace. So with this in mind, we set out to answer 2 questions over the course of our project. Our first question is, why are disabled individuals not hired at the same rate as their peers without disabilities? And alternatively, why may disabled individuals be reluctant to enter the workforce? Our second question is, how do states' political environments with a specific focus on Texas and California impact the way disability-based discrimination employment cases are handled?
So for our project, we used an array of primary and secondary research. Our primary research consisted of surveys and interviews with lawyers, NGOs, recruiters, and individuals with disabilities. Lawyers were broadly asked about which sides they had represented, jurisdictions, and usual outcomes. NGOs and recruiters were questioned about barriers in hiring and which subgroups of people with disabilities had the most difficulties pre- and post-employment. And individuals with disabilities were asked about their employment history, accommodations, and their perceived obstacles to employment. So I'll pass it on to Maddie to discuss our secondary.
Thank you, Laura. So yes, simultaneously, our group completed secondary research in the form of a data analysis and a literature review. So the data analysis included finding and logging information on disability discrimination lawsuits, particularly their settlement costs. So these cases were primarily found through U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission press releases, which is the EEOC, as well as PACER data and U.S. Courts ADA judicial findings. So these are the main sources we use to find these settlement costs. As well, EEOC statistics were used to analyze overall settlement costs and larger trends. And of course, as listed below, there were some limitations that played factors in our project, including low response rates from lawyers and recruiters during the primary data collection process. Also, we only used around 2 comprehensive data sources in our secondary analysis, even though those sources were strong, and time and sample size were limitations as well. We only had so much time to send out these surveys and record responses. So throughout secondary data collection, our group came across some quite notable data points, some of which were singled out in our issue brief due to how shockingly high their settlement costs were. For example, in 2013, Hill County Farms paid a $240 million settlement due to a disability discrimination case. And 2 years earlier, in 2011, Verizon Communications was forced to pay a $20 million price tag for discrimination as well. And throughout the years, Walmart has paid a series of very large settlements, with a $125 million settlement being paid just this year in 2021 due to disability discrimination. Of course, these figures show just how financially important and urgent it is for companies to hire and properly accommodate for persons with disabilities, because if the ADA is not followed correctly, large sums of money can and do come out of employers' pockets. Alrighty, so one key finding that was utilized throughout our paper was a study published by JAN, or the Job Accommodation Network, for those who don't know. This is an organization that assists employers, individuals with disabilities, and family members of disabled people in navigating the ADA. So this study, which we really use throughout our issue brief, has been ongoing since 2004, and it's consistently found through surveys of employers that 56% of disability accommodations come with no cost at all. And accommodations that do come with a cost average a price tag of about $500, which of course for many employers is rather low in the grand scheme of costs.
Awesome. So we're going to be going into some of our data. So thank you, Maddie. And as she mentioned right now, the cost for accommodations extremely low. So what's the cost of not accommodating? We found an EEOC database that has statistics from 1997 to 2020 of every single settlement, resolution, any kind that you want from EEOC. And so we made this beautiful chart to see if there's a trend. And obviously, as you can see, there's about like a 350% increase in the monetary benefits from a settlement. Monetary benefits refer to absolutely anything that comes with the cost of having the settlement and the settlement amount itself. So like lawyers' fees, stuff like that. And yes, as you can see, around 1997, it was around $41 million compiled for that year, all the EEOC cases. But near 2020 and near 2017, it's clearly above $100 million, which is significantly larger than an average cost of $500 or 50% of those accommodations costing absolutely nothing. So we went more into depth with this database because it provided a lot of important information. And so this is the information about the ADA employment resolutions in general. So that's everything including settlements. It could be open, it could be closed, et cetera, et cetera. And so as you can see, there is a trend and it is rising, but it is not as substantial as our monetary benefits graph, which further emphasizes that it's not necessarily that there's more cases coming that's having an average price tag. The cases are still growing, not as significantly, but the settlement amounts that's coming from those cases are growing so dramatically. And also we did a lot of data analysis on states because we had a hypothesis that state laws, state culture, past political beliefs around disability justice would have an impact on that state, how cases are handled, how many cases there are. And so we used the United States courts data on this information, and we found that California, one of the states that we focused on the most, has around 30% of all the filings in the United States for these ADA civil rights cases. That is a dramatic number. The only two states that come even close, not even close, is like New York and Pennsylvania. Everything else, it has like around a 1% rate, which is absolutely insane and kind of adds to our point that the laws, the cultures, and the beliefs around disability advocacy impact the state itself. And so this graph shows the United States cases in this orange part that are filed by California. And then the pink part is every single 49 state except California. So it's pretty crazy, as you can see. We also looked into Texas because we thought it would be interesting to compare a red and blue state, and Texas is an iconic red state, so that is why we chose it. And we use about 35 cases from the ADA press releases to make this graph. And so as you can see, there is not a trend that we could really establish from this information. However, it's clear that settlement benefits have been growing since 2014 significantly, as they're now around in the $100,000 range for the median. We also understand that there are more costs than just monetary fees that these organizations and companies are paying when they choose not to comply with the ADA. And one of those things is time. As people say in the business world, time is money. So how much time will you be spending on a case if you choose not to accommodate for your disabled employee? Well, as we found, the median years spent is around 1 year, so 0.94 years. And the median amount of days is around 365. And so these are from 92 EEOC 88 cases from the years 2017 to 2020. And it shows us that not only are you going to be paying a ton of money, you're going to be spending a ton of time on this, whereas implementing accommodation, much simpler, easier, quicker, and cheaper. And as you can see, the 1 year doesn't really apply to everything. There are outliers. Some cases have taken 8 years, which is a dramatic amount of time. So it's important to remember that there are other costs other than lawyers' fees and settlements in this finding. And lastly, we wanted to look at the type of discrimination that was happening. Why are people filing these lawsuits? Are there trends? Are there significant categories? And from around 222 EEOC cases that we found from their press releases between the years 2010 and 2020, we found that there are some major categories. And I divided them up into discrimination, accommodation, and hiring. So discrimination refers to being fired after getting the job. So you already have the job, and then your employer either finds out you have a disability from you telling them, from them like breaking a HIPAA law and looking at your medical reports, or even forcing you to take a test, a medical exam that is not required. And so that's what discrimination refers to. These people were fired from their jobs for having a disability. Accommodation refers to basically what we talked about, implementing absolutely anything. It could be a change in place, it could be an assistive item, absolutely anything, providing that accommodation for the person with disability. And so the accommodation refers to having the job already, requesting an accommodation, and getting fully denied. And then we have hiring. So what hiring refers to is a large amount of persons with disabilities are getting these interviews. They're doing great. They get the job, and then their employer sees them in person, or their employer finds out they have a disability, and all of a sudden the job's taken away. Hiring also refers to discriminating against persons with disabilities and preventing them from even having the interview. So as you can see, it's pretty divided up between these three categories just based on these 222 cases. And it definitely shows that there's a larger issue within the disability justice community, because a lot of these persons with disabilities are getting hired, are welcomed, up until the employer finds out they have a disability, which is probably very sad and unfortunate. So I'm going to be giving this to Vanessa to go over some more secondary research findings.
Other than just avoiding the very hefty lawsuit costs that Sophie just outlined, there are many benefits to hiring people with disabilities. The Journal of Occupational Rehabilitation provides many reasons as to how and why people with disabilities provide valuable resources to companies, such as improvements in profitability, such as like the profits and cost effectiveness, turnover and retention, reliability, employee loyalty, company image, but also having a competitive advantage. For example, diverse customers, customer loyalty and satisfaction, productivity, work ethic, safety, and also having an inclusive work culture for all employees to practice ability awareness, and also having an improved quality of life and income for individuals with disabilities. Additionally, an Accenture report published in 2018 found even more benefits of inclusion for employers, such as increased innovation, which I touched on above, but it basically just means that since persons with disabilities have to be creative to adapt to worlds around them, they're able to develop a lot of strengths, such as problem-solving skills, persistence, and willingness to experiment, which is all very essential for these thriving companies. It also allows for improved shareholder value. Businesses that hire people with disabilities and foster inclusive cultures report bottom line benefits that show proven return on investment. And there's also improved productivity, because they show that working alongside employees with disabilities makes non-disabled individuals more aware of how to make the workplace more inclusive for everyone. And the staff turnover is also a lot lower, by up to 30%, when a well-run disability community outreach program is in place. And lastly, but definitely not the most extensive list, there's also an enhanced reputation. Many companies that adopt inclusive marketing and advertising efforts tend to stand out from the competition as well.
Thanks, Vanessa. So in addition to secondary data, we collected primary data. And so now I will talk about what we learned from surveying interviewing lawyers. So in total, 3 lawyers completed our survey and 1 respondent partially completed it. All said they handle cases involving disability-based discrimination in the workplace, and all said they typically represent the plaintiff. So now I'm going to go into the three major points that we found from surveying and interviewing our lawyers. So 67% of survey respondents, so that's 2 out of 3, said 50% to 75% of cases involving disability-based discrimination in the workplace resulted in favor of the plaintiff. Additionally, 67% of survey respondents said they settle 75% to 100% of their cases. The other 33% of survey respondents, that would be 1 out of 3, said they settle 50% to 75% of their cases. And so when deciding whether to settle a case, respondents cited numerous factors, including but not limited to client and employer's interest in settlement, the strength of the case, economic damages, and emotional distress for the plaintiff. Our last finding was that 67% of survey respondents, so once again, 2 out of 3, said they file most of their cases in federal court. The other 33%, so that would be 1 out of 3 respondents, said they file most of their cases in state court. Currently, employees cannot sue state employers in federal court for violating Title I of the ADA. There is such a thing called the Sovereign Immunity Clause, which is granted by the 11th Amendment, and it protects states from being sued in federal court unless the federal government waives these protections or the state consents to being sued. So we had the opportunity to speak with Kel Simon, who is an employment law attorney in Texas, and he said that he files cases against private and federal employers in federal court, while he files cases against state employers in district and state court under Texas anti-discrimination state law. And this is really important because we have to remember that states have different political environments and they have different protections against disability-based force. So for example, Simon noted that Texas's laws are stringent than California's laws because they cap monetary damages that plaintiffs can receive. And now I also to talk about people with disabilities.
Thank you. So in addition to the multiple key findings for lawyers, we found many with individuals with disabilities. We were able to survey 11 individuals total, which gave us really insightful data points. So 64% of the survey respondents, which is 7 of the 11, reported that they were unemployed, but all had reported that they were employed in the past. So there were 4 respondents, or 36%, who were employed currently that they all reported that they were being paid market salary. 36%, so 4 of 11, reported their organization had no policy in place at the moment for accommodations, whereas 55%, so 6 out of the 11, reported accommodation policy, and there was 1 no response. In regards to the actual job process and hiring process, 45%, so 5 out of the 11, reported that there were no barriers during their process. 18, so 2 out of 11, reported that there were attitudinal barriers, and 27%, so 3 of 11, reported physical barriers. They reported difficulties with the interview process and also mentioned their physical mannerisms in an interview were being watched over, and they also reported hearing difficulties as barriers to employment.
For our NGO survey,
Okay, Laura's going to introduce the NGOs.
sorry. For our NGO surveys and interviews, we communicated with organizations that work to improve employment levels of persons with disabilities. When asked about what they considered employers' largest reservation in hiring people with disabilities, most believed it was due to perceived high accommodation cost, and this was followed closely by a perceived lack of productivity. Additionally, respondents noted that employers didn't always believe that individuals with disabilities could do the job, and that some may additionally believe that people with disabilities created more problems than solutions in the workforce. They also largely agreed that people with significant physical disabilities had the most difficulty pre-employment and after being hired, and a common second choice for this included people with visual impairments or intellectual disabilities. In addition to our survey responses, we had several interviews conducted with representatives from these NGOs. Responses and outlooks varied significantly across these interviews, but overall, interviewees noticed a shift in the perception of people with disabilities since the passing of the ADA, but they were skeptical of how much this has resulted in actual change in the employment situations of people with disabilities.
Alrighty. So as for the survey sent to recruiters, one respondent voiced that the disability employment gap is primarily due to a lack of applicants. And we determined that this lack of applicants could be due to stereotype and attitude-related barriers that employers tend to have towards disabled folks, which by Lara was voiced in the NGO survey. However, the other respondents selected that the employment gap is primarily due to a lack of budget for accommodations with persons with disabilities. And with the secondary data collection and analysis present in this issue brief that demonstrates the low cost of disability accommodations, especially when compared to the high costs of disability discrimination lawsuit settlements, it is hoped that we are able to change employers' minds so that this is no longer a misconception that exists. And now back to Lara.
So throughout our research, we looked into what organizations and recruitment companies, NGOs, were working to focus on disability hiring specifically. And in doing so, we found quite a few notable examples. Included Disabled Person, which is a nonprofit that runs a job board for people with disabilities. Rangam, which is a staffing agency focused on neurodiverse talent and autism employment. And Careers with Vision, which is a project run jointly by the National Industries for the Blind and American Publishing House for the Blind that focuses specifically on blind and visually impaired job seekers. So each of these organizations focused on working sort of like a LinkedIn account and getting people with disabilities access to jobs where employers were actively seeking out people with disabilities.
Thank you, Lara. So after attaining this issue brief, it is hoped that employers will take concrete steps to increase the number of disabled folks in their workforce. It is recommended that employers who wish to reap the multitude of benefits from hiring a greater percentage of persons with disabilities take a multifaceted approach. So first, our group recommends that employers aim to hire a certain percentage of folks with disabilities by a certain date in the near future for higher stakeholder value. So say, for example, by 2030, a company commits itself, like say committing to be carbon neutral, like some companies are doing, but say instead they commit themselves to hiring a certain heightened percentage of folks with disabilities. So say it's 30%, from 15%. And this can be accomplished by hiring a greater number of recruiters that specialize in disability inclusion. Now off to Vanessa for our other recommendations.
Thank you, Maddie. So the other recommendations that we have suggested that minor tweaks with large impacts can also be made to appeal to attract potential employees with disabilities. These things can be approaches to recruiting and platforms used, having closed captioning in interviews if they're through Zoom, generating awareness building through recruitment efforts, disability education programs, and grassroots-led efforts, for example, an employee resource group and events. And lastly, we also have a recommendation that employers can also make a conscious effort to avoid negative stereotypes and attitudes towards people with disabilities during the hiring process and throughout employment to retain increased percentages of people with disabilities. This also can include things like modifying language used to make it appropriate and implementing practices that encourage and progress persons with disabilities.
Thanks, Vanessa. So it's pretty clear that our research is just the tip of the iceberg. It shouldn't be the end of research into disability-based discrimination in the workplace. So now I'm going to be walking everyone through some questions we believe future researchers should investigate. So the first question is, which industry sectors saw the greatest number of disabled employees file employment discrimination cases and why? So answering this question may offer insight into which sectors are the least friendly to disabled employees and can be an important first step to increasing protections in that specific sector. Our second question is, how does the sovereign immunity clause impact cases filed against state employers? Should cases filed against state employers under Title I of the ADA be heard in federal courts? And so this goes back to our discussion about jurisdictional level and what level cases are filed in. And as a result, what laws apply. So for example, would cases filed in state court under state law have different outcomes if they were filed in federal court under the ADA? Researching this question can hopefully help answer these questions. Third, how can federal and state-sponsored programs encourage employers to pursue equitable hiring practices of people with disabilities? So once again, answering this question can help companies implement more equitable practices that can close the disability employment gap, which I believe right now is hovering around 40%. The last question we hope that future researchers can explore is, how do disability-based discrimination cases affect premiums required by private companies with employment practices liability insurance? So private companies with employment practices liability insurance may be hit with increasing premiums if they are sued by employees who allege discrimination. So maybe increasing premiums can act as a tool for deterring discriminatory behavior by reluctant employers. And now I will pass it off to Laura to talk about how to address limitations.
So as mentioned earlier by Maddie, there are several limitations to our project, including a lack of responses in primary data, few sources of secondary data, sample size. And we feel these could be addressed in a number of ways. First, by better networking to increase the number of surveys and interview responses we're able to get. And this could also be aided by a longer time frame and continuing this as a long-term project in order to foster more connection building and those responses. And then lastly, we thought it might be a good idea to divide our survey response categories, so the NGOs, recruiters, et cetera, between the 4 members or however many were to work on the project in the future, so that one person would become kind of an expert in that specific spot. So someone working specifically with recruiters to better network with them, increase responses, and develop a stronger understanding of that particular field and their role in fostering a more inclusive workforce.
In conclusion, employment discrimination is a serious issue that must be addressed because the benefits of hiring disabled employees is immense. A large body of previous research shows that disability inclusion efforts are a boon to employees. As we've mentioned a couple times, the Accenture report in 2018 published a lot of great findings about the benefits of hiring people with disabilities. According to a lot of the research that we found, employees with disabilities offer tangible benefits, many that we've already talked about, like the increased innovation, improved productivity, and a better work environment. But of course, workers are also consumers too, and the GDP could get a boost of up to $25 billion if just 1% more of persons with disabilities join the US labor force. I'll now pass it over to Sabrina to talk about low accommodation costs and the importance of our research.
Thanks, Vanessa. So adding on to what Vanessa just said, our research indicates that accommodation costs are far lower than what employers would have to pay in settlements. So if we're weighing the costs and benefits of equity in the workplace, it is far more cost effective for employers to accommodate disabled employees. Accommodations may require some upfront costs, but it will be far more effective in the long run, considering employers doled out nearly $110 million in settlement costs in 2020. And so our findings could not have come at a more urgent time. As we said previously, the average disability employment gap is around 40%, but we are more than 1 year into a pandemic that has wrecked the global economy and catapulted many into unemployment. For example, the New Hampshire University Institute on Disability found that around 1 million disabled employees lost their jobs since March 2020. Additionally, the Bureau found that 1 in 5 disabled employees lost their jobs, compared to 1 in 7 employees without disabilities. In conclusion, it's crucial for employers to create an equitable workplace for all, as global crises may arise unexpectedly in the future. We hope our research reinforces the importance of hiring disabled employees and keeping them in the workforce. Thank you.